In 1832, a trooper in the British Cavalry Regiment, the Scots Greys, described the first stroke of his flogging with a vicious cat of nine tails. It was, he said, like a knife going through his body. The pain in his lungs worse than in his back. He almost bit his tongue in two. Fans of Richard Sharpe know it well. Bernard Cornwell's hero was sentenced to 2,000 lashes, enduring 200 in Sharpe's Tiger, while Sergeant Harper was also flogged. Sharpe might be fictional, but flogging in the British Army was very real indeed. But just how brutal was it? How many lashes might a man actually have to endure? And when did the practice finally end? This is the story of flogging in the British Army. Before we get to all the gory details of floggings, and trust me, they are gory, I want to take you down a strange legal rabbit hole with regard to the history of discipline in the British Army. Trust me, it's as fascinating as the subject of flogging itself. Up to the late 1600s, there was no standing army in England. Troops were raised when needed, fought their campaign, and were sent home. Discipline was governed by what was called the Articles of War. These were rules issued by the monarch under royal prerogative. However, and this is where it gets fun, the Articles of War only applied in wartime. In peacetime, soldiers on English soil fell under common law, just like everyone else. And common law courts had no authority over military-specific offences. It was, quite frankly, a legal mess waiting to happen. And in March 1689, it did. When William of Orange took the throne from James II during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, most of the army accepted the new king. Most, but not all. The following year, the Royal Scots, fiercely loyal to James, mutinied at Ipswich whilst awaiting transport to serve in Flanders. Refusing to obey William's orders, they turned around and marched north towards Scotland, and there was nothing that the king or his officers could do about it, because they were on English soil in peacetime. Thanks to the Articles of War, the government had no legal mechanism to punish them. And so, Parliament passed the Mutiny Act in 1689. Now by law, mutiny, desertion and sedition by soldiers in peacetime were trialable by court-martial. Still wary of monarchs such as the ousted King James and his father Charles I using the army to impose tyrannical rule, and also fully aware that Oliver Cromwell had used the standing army to do just that, Parliament insisted that the Mutiny Act had to be renewed on an annual basis. So, whilst in theory a king could retain a standing army and attempt to impose tyrannical rule if they wanted to, if the Act was not renewed by Parliament, that army had no legal basis for maintaining discipline. Neat trick, eh? Now, you might think that the Mutiny Act had sorted out military discipline, but the legal picture was more complicated than it first appears, because the Act merely covered troops in peacetime. Whilst on active service, the Articles of War still prevailed. The Mutiny Act was soon expanded well beyond mutiny and desertion. Courts-martial gained authority over an enormous range of offences, and the punishments available were severe. The British Army had a range of sanctions that reflected the harshness of 18th and 19th century military life. Branding was primarily used to mark deserters. If a man bearing the letter D on his body tried to enlist in another regiment, and deserters frequently did to collect a fresh signing-on bounty, the mark on his torso would identify him at the medical inspection. In the early days, this was done with a red-hot iron. But by the 19th century, it had evolved into a forced tattoo. The wound was rubbed with indigo and Indian ink to make the mark permanent. Branding was abolished in 1871. Then there was the wooden horse, a sharp-edged beam set on high legs, on which the condemned man was forced to sit astride, sometimes with muskets tied to his feet to increase the downward pressure. And let's not forget the whirligig, a wooden cage that was spun repeatedly, inducing violent nausea and disorientation. And of course, for the most serious offences, murder, mutiny, cowardice, repeated desertion, there was death either by hanging or firing squad. The most common punishment, however, was flogging. Even by the 1840s, Lord John Russell reported to Parliament that in 1838, 1 in every 108 soldiers had been flogged. And that was in peacetime and with a growing public outcry. Imagine what the figures were like back in the Napoleonic Wars. Flogging became the workhorse of British military discipline. It was immediate, it was public, and it was cheap. The offences that could earn a man the lash were breathtaking in their triviality. Drunkenness, probably not surprisingly, was the single biggest driver of flogging sentences. But other offences included insubordination, theft, and absence without leave. But how about these ones? Being deficient of a razor, 200 lashes. Improper use of barrack bedding, whatever that means, 400 lashes. In 1828, 2 NCOs at Kilkenny Barracks received 1,000 lashes each for writing deceitful letters. Now, it's worth noting that flogging applied exclusively to rank and file. Officers, as gentlemen and holders of the King's Commission, were never subjected to corporal punishment of any kind. Their punishment came through reputation and pocket, reprimands, forfeiture of seniority, dismissal, or the ultimate sanction, cashiering. That meant dismissal in a public ceremony, where the man's epaulets were ripped from his shoulders, his sword broken, his medals dashed to the ground, all to the strains of the Rogue's March. And of course, under the purchase system, cashiering also meant losing every penny he or his family had invested in his commission. Back to the rank and file. What was a flogging actually like? The whip was the cat o' nine tails, similar to the Navy version, although not as heavy. The Army cat had a drumstick handle with 9 code-lined strings, each about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. Unlike the Navy cat, the thinner, denser cords used by the Army were actually more likely to cut. A fresh cat was made for every punishment, and it would be swapped during the flogging when it became matted with blood and flesh. I told you it was gory. The ceremony, and it was a ceremony, followed a rigid format. The entire regiment was drawn up in a 3-sided square. The prisoner was marched out. The charge and the sentence read aloud. In the infantry, he was stripped to the waist and tied by his wrists and ankles to a triangle formed from 3 halberds, the ceremonial poles carried by sergeants, lashed together. In cavalry regiments, he was tied to a ladder. The commanding officer gave the order, the regimental adjutant signalled the start, and a drum began to beat. Each stroke was delivered in slow time, 1 lash every 12 seconds, tapped out to the beat of that drum. In infantry regiments, the flogging was actually delivered by the regimental drummers. And whilst we tend to have Victorian notions of drummers being boys, and they certainly were recruited from the age of 12, many drummers remained in that role for the whole of their military career. This in itself created mixed results when it came to flogging. Whilst grown men had the strength to swing the cat longer, adolescent drummers tired quickly and couldn't deliver blows with the same force. Consequently, drummers were rotated after every 25 lashes. Nevertheless, you can imagine the psychological effect of a young drummer participating in a flogging. One witness described a young drummer in the Coldstream Guards, weeping, unnerved and unable to strike with vigour, while the drum major beat him with a cane to keep him to his duty. John Shipp, who rose from drummer to lieutenant, later wrote that he had personally inflicted flogging 3 times a week for 8 years. But to some extent, those receiving a flogging in the infantry regiments were lucky. They might get a youth striking them. There was no such luck in the cavalry regiments. Here the floggings were delivered by the regimental farriers, their powerfully built blacksmiths, used to heavy physical work, and they struck considerably harder. A regimental surgeon stood by throughout, with authority to halt the punishment if he believed the man's life was in danger. The rest of the regiment were compelled to watch. Fainting among both the ranks and some newer officers was not uncommon. The number of lashes varied enormously. Before 1807 there was no formal upper limit. During the Napoleonic Wars, sentences of 500 lashes were routine, and 1,000 were not unheard of. Early 20th century military historian Charles Oman claimed that 1,200 lashes were ordered on at least 9 occasions during the Peninsular War alone. Just to give you some measure of such a beating, during Richard Sharpe's admittedly fictional flogging, by the time he reached his 169th lash, his ribs were showing. By his 174th, he was barely conscious. In 1812, the Duke of York capped regimental court-martials at a mere 300 lashes. After the death of Private Frederick White in 1846, which I'll come to shortly, the Duke of Wellington himself reduced the maximum to 50. So, what did it feel like to be on the receiving end of such a beating? Alexander Somerville of the Scots Greys, flogged in 1832 for writing a newspaper letter sympathetic to political reform, left one of the most vivid accounts that we have. He described an, quote, outstanding sensation between the shoulders that went to his toenails and fingernails, as if a knife had gone through the body, unquote. The pain in his lungs, he said, was more severe than in his back. He bit his tongue almost in two. Somerville's case caused a national outcry. A public subscription of £300 was raised, with which he purchased his discharge, hardly surprising, and became a journalist. He died 2 decades later in poverty in a woodshed in Toronto, Canada. But the case that changed everything was that of Private Frederick White of the 7th Hussars at Hounslow in 1846. Whilst drunk, White had touched a sergeant with a metal bar. He was sentenced to 150 lashes. The flogging was carried out on the 15th of June in front of 200 to 300 men. His shoulders bled after 20 strokes. He never cried out. He was admitted to hospital, seemed to have recovered, and then deteriorated. He died on the 11th of July. The army's autopsy put it down to natural causes. But the local vicar was suspicious and alerted the Middlesex coroner, a man named Thomas Wackley, who happened to be the founder of the medical publication The Lancet, and a long-standing opponent of flogging. Wackley ordered an inquest and 2 further autopsies. The surgeon, Erasmus Wilson, concluded that White's death was directly caused by the flogging. The jury agreed and called for abolition. The Duke of Wellington, by now Commander-in-Chief of the forces, immediately reduced the maximum punishment to 50 lashes. Meanwhile, Wackley founded the Flogging Abolition Society, and the long road to reform had begun in earnest. The annual renewal of the Mutiny Act, yes, it was still being debated annually after 150 years, gave opponents of flogging a guaranteed parliamentary platform, and they used it. Every year the debate returned, and every year the defenders of the system pushed back. Their argument was always the same, and it was actually Wellington's argument, that the British Army recruited from the lowest classes of society. Men who enlisted for drink, for debt, to escape the consequences of fathering bastard children. Without the immediate threat of corporal punishment, how could you possibly maintain discipline with those sort of men? And the reformers, well, they had a ready answer. Look at the rest of Europe. France had abolished military corporal punishment in 1790 during the Revolution. The logic was ideological. The soldier was now a citizen in arms, and a citizen could not be flogged. Prussia had followed suit after its catastrophic defeat at Jena in 1806. Scharnhorst's military reforms swept away running the gauntlet and the cane as part of a wholesale modernisation of the Prussian army. Even the United States, whose Continental Army had initially embraced flogging every bit as enthusiastically as the redcoat British, with Washington himself demanding the right to impose 500 lashes, finally abolished it in 1861, at the start of the Civil War. There was a caveat. France didn't actually become more merciful. It simply shifted to a sort of a binary system. Either you were a citizen soldier in good standing, so couldn't be flogged, or if you weren't, you were shot. Napoleon's military tribunals executed men for desertions and pillage without much deliberation. The lash may have gone from the French army, but the firing squad more than took its place. In Britain, the road to abolition was a slow one. Each step was fought over in Parliament, and each step was usually triggered by a death or a scandal. Even during the Crimean War, the practice prevailed. Those of you who've watched the 1968 film Charge of the Light Brigade, starring amongst others Trevor Howard, John Gielgud and Vanessa Redgrave, might recall the flogging overseen by Lord Cardigan in that film. During the Crimean War, Lance Corporal Macmillan of the Coldstream Guards recorded witnessing the post-1847 maximum of 50 lashes inflicted on a man called Swift for striking a sergeant. What with the general suffering of the troops through poor logistics and medical care, flogging simply reinforced the argument of reformers that the British Army needed to change. In 1859, peacetime flogging was restricted to men judged to be of bad character. In 1867, following the death of Private Robert Slim after a flogging, the Cardwell reforms partially abolished it, retaining flogging only for mutiny and aggravated insubordination during peacetime, although with wider scope in wartime. Branding was abolished in 1871. Change was in the air. In 1879, the maximum number of lashes was reduced to 25. Despite Private Hook in the film Zulu, set in that same year, being told that stealing and drinking Dr. Witt's brandy was a flogging offence, Hookie. By the late 1870s, flogging, while still available, was barely used at all. The practice was dying before the law finally caught up. The end came in 1881 under Gladstone's Liberal government as part of the Childers reforms. Section 6 of the Army Act, 1881, abolished flogging in the British Army outright. The same act, incidentally, consolidated the old Mutiny Act and the Articles of War into a single code of military law for the first time, sweeping away the confusing dual system that had been in place since 1689. It's no coincidence that abolition came alongside broader reforms to the army itself. Shorter enlistments, better conditions, and a different class of recruit. Wellington's scum of the earth were being replaced by men who expected to be treated with a basic level of dignity, and the public demanded the same for their heroes and sons. Interestingly, flogging remained a punishment in military prisons until 1907, but again was rarely applied. And equally interesting, flogging in the Royal Navy was not legally abolished until the Armed Forces Act 2006. However, with an eye to the reforms taking place in the Victorian Army, flogging had been suspended by an Admiralty order in 1879 and was never used again. Whilst the abolition of flogging was all well and good, the army still needed a punishment that could be administered quickly in the field without a prison and without removing a man from his unit. The answer was field punishment, which had been introduced alongside the Cardwell restrictions in 1868. Field punishment number 1 meant that the convicted man was handcuffed and attached to a fixed object, a gunwheel, a fence post, for up to 2 hours a day. The troops called it crucifixion. During the First World War, when of course flogging was long gone, it was imposed on more than 60,000 occasions, far more than the 346 men who were executed. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. Flogging seems so far from modern times, but it was a very real part of Britain's military history. Rather like officers being able to purchase their commissions, and I've told that story recently too, so check it out in a moment. And if you like going down the rabbit holes of British history, then why not join my Patrons Club, where you get access to my exclusive talks. This week, for instance, we're exploring the Siege of Ladysmith during the Boer War, and the political career of Victorian Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Links to my Patrons Club are in the description below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.